At Eagle's Rest Farmers Market, Thomas Hayes's weathered hands trembled slightly as he arranged his vegetables, but not from age or fear. The tremor came from decades of holding a rifle steady, from days spent motionless in mud and blood, waiting for the perfect shot. 300 confirmed kills during the Civil War had earned him the nickname Ghost of Antietam, but here in Montana Territory, he was just another aging rancher. When Jake Cooper and his outlaw gang decided to terrorize the quiet market that morning, they saw an old man's shaking hands and thought they'd found easy prey. They didn't know those trembling fingers had once picked off Confederate officers at 800 yards. They were about to learn that some ghosts never truly fade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Montana hills in shades of amber and gold as Thomas Hayes began his morning routine. 20 years of ranching hadn't softened his military precision. Each task executed with methodical efficiency, each tool returned to its exact place. Old habits died hard, especially those that had kept a man alive through 4 years of war. His ranch sat strategically on a rise overlooking Eagle's Rest Valley, though few visitors recognized the tactical advantage of its position. The barn faced north, offering clear lines of sight to the main road. His house windows, specially modified, could open silently outward. Even his fence posts were spaced precisely at 50-yard intervals, range markers disguised as ordinary ranch work. Sarah, his 15-year-old niece, was already at the kitchen table when he entered. She'd come to live with him after her parents' death 3 years ago, another responsibility he'd shouldered without complaint. Like everything in his life, their morning routine was carefully orchestrated. "Morning, Uncle Thomas," she said, setting out coffee and biscuits. "Mrs. Peterson stopped by early, says the Cooper gang's been spotted near Miller's Creek." Thomas nodded, noting how Sarah's hand tightened slightly on her coffee cup. The gang had been moving closer to Eagle's Rest for weeks, following a pattern he'd seen before, in war and in peace. First came the rumors, then the isolated incidents, then the terror. "Might want to delay your trip to town," he suggested mildly, though his eyes scanned the valley through the kitchen window. "Could be the market's a bit busy today." "You're still going?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of worry. "Sheriff Matthews says they're dangerous. Killed 2 men over in Fort Benton last month." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Market days are important, child. Can't let fear rule our lives." What he didn't say was that he'd been watching the Cooper gang's movements carefully. Their pattern suggested today would be when they made their first push into Eagle's Rest. The market, with its crowds and commerce, would be their likely target. He finished his coffee and retrieved his old Spencer rifle from above the fireplace. Sarah watched him oil the weapon with practiced movements, his fingers dancing over the mechanism with familiar grace. To her, it was just her uncle's hunting rifle, but each scratch and mark on its stock told a story of a different time, a different war. "Just for the varmints," he said, catching her worried look. "Been seeing coyotes near the south pasture." The lie came easily, practiced over years of hiding his true nature. Sometimes he wondered if Sarah suspected, if she ever questioned why her quiet uncle's hands never shook when he shot, why his eyes constantly scanned horizons, why he could hear a horse's approach long before anyone else. Loading his wagon with vegetables and early summer squash, Thomas considered the day ahead. The Cooper gang would come. Men like them always did. They'd see an aging rancher, note his careful movements, mistake military precision for elderly caution. They'd see his slight limp, earned at Gettysburg, and think him weak. What they wouldn't see was how he'd positioned his wagon for the best view of the market square, how his apparently random arrangement of produce crates would provide cover if needed, how years of experience had taught him to read men's intentions in their movements, their postures, their eyes. The sun climbed higher as he drove toward town. casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the valley. Perfect shooting conditions, the soldier in him noted automatically. Clear air, slight breeze from the northwest, visibility excellent. Eagle's Rest was already bustling when he arrived, townspeople going about their business with an undercurrent of tension. He spotted Sheriff Matthews standing outside the bank, trying to project confidence despite the worry lines around his eyes. The sheriff nodded as Thomas passed, a gesture that carried more meaning than casual observers might notice. 20 years ago, they'd been different men in a different war. Matthews had been a young cavalry officer, Thomas his regiment's deadliest, Sharpshooter. Now they played their roles, the concerned sheriff, the quiet rancher, while watching their town face a familiar threat. Thomas began setting up his stall with deliberate care, each movement measured, each position chosen with tactical precision disguised as old man's fussiness. The weight of his rifle, hidden beneath the wagon seat, was a comfortable reminder that some skills never faded. He noted faces in the crowd, marking strangers, observing patterns. 3 men by the saloon weren't the drifters they pretended to be. Their boots were too good, their guns too well maintained. Cooper gang scouts, probably. 2 more lounged near the livery stable, watching the market with predatory interest. The stage was set. Now it was just a matter of waiting, something Thomas Hayes had learned to do very well indeed. After all, a sharpshooter's greatest weapon wasn't his rifle, it was his patience. As Thomas arranged his vegetables for display, the morning sun caught his silver pocket watch, triggering memories he'd spent years trying to forget. September 17th, 1862, Antietam. The watch had been his rangefinder that bloody morning, its polished, surface-catching sunlight to measure distances as Confederate officers emerged from the morning mist. "Those tomatoes looking mighty fine, Mr. Hayes," Martha Wilson called out, startling him back to the present. She was the banker's wife, proper and poised, completely unaware that the gentle farmer weighing her produce had once dropped a Confederate colonel at 600 yards, the man's own spyglass providing the perfect glint for target acquisition. "Good. Weather for tomatoes," Thomas replied mildly, his weathered hands steady as he selected the best ones for her basket. Those same hands had once been steady for very different reasons, holding position for hours in the mud of Gettysburg, waiting for the perfect shot. Sheriff Matthews drifted by his stall, seemingly casual, but Thomas recognized the tension in his old commander's stride. "Quiet morning," Matthews said, the words carrying hidden meaning. 20 years ago, they'd used the same tone to discuss Confederate movements. "So far," Thomas agreed, adjusting his produce display while scanning the growing crowd. "Reminds me of another quiet morning. Maryland, if I recall." Matthews nodded slightly, understanding the reference. They'd both been there when the quiet had shattered, when Thomas's skill with a rifle had earned him his ghostly reputation. "Let's hope this morning stays quieter than that one." As the sheriff moved on, Thomas allowed himself to drift back to that day. He'd been positioned in a small copse of trees, his spotter tracking target distances while he waited. 1 shot, 1 kill, that had been his reputation. Never spray and pray like some of the newer recruits. Always patient, always precise. To Tao, memory shifted to his last official shot of the war outside Petersburg. A Confederate sharpshooter had been terrorizing Union positions until Thomas spent 3 days tracking the man's patterns. The shot itself had been beautiful, 900 yards, accounting for wind and elevation. His spotter had called it impossible, but Thomas knew better. There was no such thing as an impossible shot, only imperfect patience. Sarah's words from breakfast echoed in his mind. "Sheriff Matthews says they're dangerous." The Cooper gang had a reputation for violence, but Thomas had seen true violence at Antietam, at Gettysburg, at a dozen other blood-soaked fields. These outlaws might be killers, but they weren't soldiers. They lacked the discipline, the patience, the understanding of how terrain and timing could turn the tide of battle. More townspeople were arriving now, the market square filling with the normal bustle of commerce. Thomas noticed how the strangers by the saloon had shifted positions, spreading out to cover more ground. Their movement patterns were predictable. He'd seen similar deployments before war, when Confederate raiders would probe small towns before. "Striking, Mr. Hayes." A young voice pulled him from his tactical assessment. Tommy Miller, the blacksmith's boy, stood before his stall, clutching a penny. "Ma wants your best carrots." Thomas smiled, remembering another young boy, himself, before the war, before he'd learned how to turn mathematics and patience into a deadly art. "Here you go, lad," he said, selecting a generous bunch. "Tell your ma to keep her doors locked today. Might be some weather coming." The boy nodded, not understanding the true warning in the old rancher's words. As Tommy scampered off, Thomas adjusted his wagon's position slightly, ensuring better coverage of the square's southern approach. The move would have seemed random to most observers, just an old man fussing with his setup, but Sheriff Matthews noticed. Their eyes met briefly across the square, Commander and Sharpshooter sharing a moment of understanding that bridged 20 years. The market's noise grew as more people arrived, but Thomas had learned long ago to filter such distractions. His awareness remained focused on the subtle signs others missed, the way those strangers moved with practiced coordination, how they maintained clear lines of sight to each other, their careful positioning near key buildings. Soon, he knew, the quiet morning would shatter. The Cooper gang would make their move, expecting to find a town ripe for plucking, defended by nothing more than an aging sheriff and frightened townspeople. They would see his trembling hands and think him weak, his careful movements and think him afraid. They would learn, as so many had learned before, that the deadliest force on any battlefield was the one you never saw coming. The ghost of Antietam had earned his name for a reason. By the time you knew he was there, it was already too late. The market square had filled by mid-morning, but Thomas noted how townspeople moved in nervous clusters, their eyes darting toward the strangers lounging near the saloon. Fear had a scent, he remembered from the war, like metal and sweat, sharp as gunpowder. He could smell it now. Jake Cooper's reputation had preceded him to Eagle's Rest, 3 banks robbed in the Dakota Territory, 2 stagecoaches hit near Fort Benton, ranches burned when their owners refused to pay protection. The gang was methodical, thorough, and utterly merciless. "They killed the McCarty boy last week," Martha Wilson whispered as she returned for more tomatoes. "Over in Sweetwater, just 17, tried to stop them taking his father's horses." Her hands shook as she counted out coins. "Sheriff there couldn't do anything. They say Cooper has 20 men now, maybe more." Thomas arranged her purchase carefully, his mind calculating angles and distances, even as he played the role of concerned farmer. 20 men meant 5 or 6 would be scouts, another 8 for the main force, the rest held in reserve. "Standard cavalry tactics, adapted for outlaws. Heard they've got someone inside the bank," Tommy Miller added, lingering near Thomas's stall. "Ma says that new teller, Mr. Phillips, been asking strange questions about delivery schedules." The information confirmed Thomas's own observations. He'd noticed Phillips taking unusual routes home, stopping briefly near the saloon where Cooper's men now waited. The gang was professional. He'd give them that. But professionals could be predicted, their patterns recognized by those who knew how to watch. Sheriff Matthews made another pass, his badge catching the morning sun. "Getting warm," he commented, the same tone he'd used before battle. "Might storm later." "South wind's picking up," Thomas agreed, their old code flowing naturally. South wind meant reinforcements approaching. The gang's main force must be nearby. Movement near the bank caught his attention. Phillips, the teller, had stepped outside ostensibly to sweep the boardwalk. His pattern of sweeping was deliberate, 3 strokes, pause, 2 strokes, pause. Military signal code, modified but recognizable to anyone trained in battlefield communication. "What's that, Mr. Hayes?" Tommy asked, noticing how Thomas had gone still. "Just watching birds, son," Thomas replied softly. "Sometimes you can tell. There's storms coming by how they move." His eyes tracked the teller's movements, while his hands continued arranging vegetables. Phillips was signaling positions, timing, details that would matter soon. More townspeople were noticing the tension now. Mothers gathered their children closer. Men tried to look brave while keeping their families behind them. Even the town drunk, old Pete Wilson, had gone quiet in his corner, roomy eyes showing unexpected clarity as he watched Cooper's men. Thomas thought of Sarah, safe at the ranch. He'd taught her to bar the doors, to use the rifle if needed, but he prayed it wouldn't. Come to that, his war had ended 20 years ago. He'd chosen this quiet life deliberately, seeking peace in the rhythms of farming and the simplicity of honest work. But as he watched Cooper's scouts shift positions, noted their practiced movements and the quality of their weapons, he knew peace was no longer an option. These men would bring war to Eagle's Rest, not with armies and cannons, but with the creeping violence of outlaws who mistook civilians' mercy for weakness. "Time to pack up, Tommy," he said quietly, beginning to consolidate his remaining produce. "Tell your ma to stay home this afternoon. Weather's turning." The boy nodded, sensing the gravity in the old rancher's tone. As he hurried away, Thomas made his final preparations. His wagon was positioned perfectly now, offering cover and a stable shooting platform if needed. His Spencer rifle lay within, easy reach, wrapped in an old blanket that would muffle its distinctive shape until the moment it was needed. 20 years of peace had built his reputation as a quiet farmer, a gentle man who grew the valley's best vegetables and never caused trouble. That reputation was about to change. As Cooper's men began their final positioning, Thomas felt the familiar calm settling over him, the sniper's serenity that turned his hands steady and his eye sharp. The ghost of Antietam had stayed hidden for 2 decades. Now, as he watched Jake Cooper himself ride into town with the gang's main force, Thomas knew his peaceful life had been just a pause between wars. Some men brought violence wherever they went, but they never expected to find someone who understood violence better than they did, someone who had turned it into an art of patience, precision, and carefully chosen moments. The storm was about to break over Eagle's Rest, and like every storm, Thomas Hayes had weathered. He would meet it with a rifle in his hands and steel in his heart. Jake Cooper made his entrance like a man who'd rehearsed it, riding slowly down Eagle's Rest's main street with 12 men spread behind him in a perfect arc. Their horses were quality stock, their weapons expensive, their manner carrying the casual arrogance of men unused to resistance. Cooper himself cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver-handled Colt worn low on his hip. Thomas noticed details others missed. The way Cooper's men positioned themselves to cover key approaches, how their apparently relaxed postures left their gun hands free, the subtle signals they exchanged, coordinating their movements with professional precision. "Lovely morning for a market," Cooper called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "Shame if anything were to disturb such a peaceful scene." Thomas kept his movements deliberate as he secured his wagon's brake. Cooper's men had unknowingly positioned themselves exactly where he'd expected, spread out to intimidate, but clustered enough to create perfect firing lanes. Some lessons, it seemed, never changed whether your enemy wore a Confederate uniform or Outlaw's duster. "Good people of Eagle's Rest," Cooper continued, clearly enjoying his moment. "You've no doubt heard of me, heard the stories, the warnings, the tales of what happens to towns that don't understand the new way of things." He gestured expansively. "But I'm a reasonable man. All I ask is cooperation. A small monthly fee for protection, certain considerations regarding law enforcement, and everyone stays happy and whole. Sheriff Matthews stepped forward, hand deliberately away from his gun. This is a peaceful town, Cooper. We don't want any trouble. Trouble? Cooper's laugh was theatrical. Sheriff, trouble's already here. Just ask Sweetwater, or Fort Benton, or any other town that thought they could ignore progress. His voice hardened. The smart ones learned. The others, well, fire has a way of changing minds. Thomas watched Cooper's men spreading through the crowd, herding townspeople toward the square's center. Standard military tactic: control the civilians, limit their movement options, establish dominance through fear. He'd seen Confederate raiders use similar techniques. The gang's attention focused on the bank, just as Thomas had predicted. Phillips, the corrupt teller, had emerged to provide Cooper with details about the building's security. But Thomas noticed something else: how Cooper's lieutenant kept glancing at Martha Wilson's teenage daughter, Emily. The man's expression made Thomas's trigger finger itch. As a show of good faith, Cooper announced, we'll start small, just the bank's weekly receipts. Call it an introduction to our protection services. He nodded to his men. Secure the area. Anyone moves, discourage them. The gang spread out. With practiced efficiency, Thomas counted angles, distances, positions, old habits, transforming the market square into a geometric puzzle of trajectories and firing lines. His Spencer rifle lay within reach, but the moment wasn't right. Patience. He remembered his old spotter teaching. The perfect shot requires the perfect moment. That moment came when Cooper's lieutenant grabbed Emily Wilson. Pretty thing, the man drawled, pulling her away from her screaming mother. Maybe I'll keep this one as a personal bonus. Martha Wilson's cry of despair cut through the square. Sheriff Matthews stepped forward, but froze as multiple guns turned his way. The lieutenant dragged Emily toward the alley, laughing at her struggles. Thomas moved. His first motion knocked over his vegetable crate, the clatter drawing the lieutenant's attention. The man turned, irritated at the distraction, and found himself staring into eyes that had once picked off Confederate officers at 800 yards. "Let her go, son," Thomas said quietly, his farmer's facade falling away like autumn leaves. "That's not a request," the lieutenant sneered clearly, seeing only an old man with trembling hands. "Mind your business, Gramps, or—" The Spencer rifle seemed to materialize in Thomas's hands, his movements so smooth they appeared almost lazy. But there was nothing lazy about his aim. The shot cracked across the square like summer lightning, hitting precisely where Thomas intended, the lieutenant's gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away in a spray of blood. 20 years of peace shattered with that single shot. The ghost of Antietam had returned to war. Time seemed to freeze in the wake of Thomas's shot. The lieutenant clutched his ruined hand, his face a mask of shock and pain. Emily Wilson scrambled back to her mother's arms. Cooper's men stood motionless, their confident swagger replaced by wary confusion as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Thomas kept his rifle trained on Cooper, his hands now perfectly steady. "Your man crossed a line," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used directing artillery fire at Gettysburg. "Take him and leave. There won't be a second warning." Cooper studied Thomas with new eyes, noting details he'd previously dismissed. The precise way he held the rifle, the perfect shooting stance, the unwavering aim that spoke of thousands of practiced shots. "Interesting," Cooper said softly. "You're not just some farmer, are you?" His hand hovered near his Colt. "That shot military training? Ghost of Antietam," Sheriff Matthews called out, his own gun now drawn. "That's what they called him. 300 confirmed kills. Could pick off a Confederate officer at 800 yards. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even Cooper's men shifted uneasily. The war might have ended 20 years ago, but its legends still carried weight. The ghost, Cooper's lieutenant managed through clenched teeth. "That's just stories, campfire tales to scare." A second shot cracked across the square, kicking up dust precisely 1 inch from Cooper's boot. "Next one won't miss," Thomas said quietly, "and I've got 16 rounds left, more than enough for every man who means this town harm." Cooper raised his hands slowly, a calculating look in his eyes. "Peace, Ghost, we're leaving." He gestured to his men. "For now!" As the gang mounted up, Cooper locked eyes with Thomas one final time. "Impressive shot, old man, but you just made this personal. Should have stayed hidden behind your vegetables. Now everyone knows what you are." "They know what I was," Thomas corrected. "What I am is a farmer who's chosen his ground. Remember, in that, the gang rode out, taking their wounded lieutenant with them. As their hoofbeats faded, Thomas kept his rifle ready, watching until they disappeared around the bend. Only then did he lower his weapon. "Thomas Hayes," Martha Wilson breathed, still clutching Emily. "All these years. You've been protecting us all along, haven't you?" Tommy Miller asked, his young face alight with awe. "Watching, waiting." Thomas began carefully packing his wagon, his movements once again those of a simple farmer. "They'll be back," he said to Matthews. 3 days, maybe 4. Time to gather reinforcements, plan their revenge." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Town's not ready for a war." "No," Thomas agreed, securing his rifle. "But I am." He turned to face the gathered townspeople, seeing fear mixed with hope in their eyes. The war never really ended for men like Cooper. They just found new territories to conquer, new victims to terrorize. But they've forgotten the lessons we learned at places like Antietam and Gettysburg. "What lessons?" Tommy asked. Thomas smiled, slightly, though his eyes remained hard as he watched the horizon. "That one determined man in the right position can hold off an army. That patience and precision beat numbers and brute force, and that some old soldiers never lose their edge. We just choose when to use it." Thomas spent the afternoon fortifying his ranch with the same methodical precision he'd once used to prepare sniper positions. Every fence post, every window, every approach was evaluated with a soldier's eye. Sarah watched him work, her expression torn between fear and fascination as her quiet uncle transformed before her eyes. "Cooper's men will come from the north," he explained, positioning hay bales to create subtle firing positions. "They'll try to use the morning sun to blind defenders. Standard tactics. I saw raiders use it in Virginia. Why not just leave?" Sarah asked, helping him move a wagon to block the barn's southern approach. "We could go to Denver, start fresh." Thomas paused, studying the distant hills where he'd already spotted Cooper's scouts watching the ranch. "Because running never stops men like Cooper. Give them one victory, they'll take 1,000. He checked his rifle's action. "Besides, ground you know is ground you can defend." Sheriff Matthews arrived, as sunset painted the valley in shades of red and gold. He wasn't alone. 6 townsmen accompanied him, including Tommy Miller's father, the blacksmith. "Cooper's gathering. Men," Matthews reported grimly. "Riders coming in from all over the territory. Word is he's offering double shares to anyone who'll help take down the ghost of Antietam." "Let them come," Miller said, his massive arms crossed. "Town's with you, Thomas. We've watched you 20 years, never knowing what you were. Time we stood together." Thomas evaluated the volunteers with a professional's eye. Miller was strong, steady. The others showed varying degrees of capability, but all had the look of men who'd chosen their ground. "Won't be easy," Thomas warned. "Cooper's men are killers. They won't hesitate to burn the whole valley to get to me." "They'll burn it anyway," Matthews countered. "You taught me that at Antietam. Sometimes you have to make your stand, whatever the cost." Thomas nodded, memories of that bloody dawn surfacing. "First, we prepare. Miller, your forge. Can you modify wagon plates for armor?" "Already started," the blacksmith grinned. Remembered how you always said good cover beats good shooting. Windows need reinforcing, Thomas continued, his tactical mind mapping defenses. Firing positions established. Every man needs to know exactly where to be when trouble comes. He turned to Matthews. The town? Setting up barricades, organizing watches. Cooper's reputation works against him now. Folks would rather fight than face his kind of mercy. As they planned, Sarah brought coffee and biscuits. Thomas noticed how she studied their preparations, her quick mind clearly cataloguing details. Like him, she had a gift for observation. "Uncle," she said quietly, "the root cellar. It connects to the old mine shaft, doesn't it? The one that runs under the North Ridge." Thomas smiled slightly. Even after 20 years, some secrets remained. "Good girl. Emergency escape route if needed, but it could also let us flank any force attacking from that direction." The men worked through twilight, transforming the ranch into a fortress while maintaining its appearance as a simple farmstead. Thomas supervised every detail, teaching as he had once taught young soldiers. "Sightlines matter more than firepower," he explained, positioning men at key points. "A good shot from cover beats 10 wild ones from exposure, and never silhouette. Yourself learned that lesson at Fredericksburg." As night fell, lanterns cast flickering shadows across the yard. Thomas stood on his porch, watching Cooper's scouts withdraw into darkness. They'd report back on the preparations, but they'd miss the subtle details. The carefully planned crossfire zones, the hidden firing ports, the escape routes that could become attack paths. "They're coming," Sarah said, joining him. Her voice carried fear but also determination. "Yes," Thomas agreed, "but they're expecting to find a famous shooter past his prime. Instead, they'll find what every army learns too late, that the deadliest weapon isn't the rifle or the man, but the preparation. The ghost of Antietam didn't earn his name with lucky shots." He touched his old Spencer rifle, feeling the familiar smoothness of its stock. Tomorrow would bring violence he'd hoped never to see again, but as he watched his neighbors preparing to defend their homes, he realized some wars chose you, no matter how far you ran from the last one. "Get some rest," he told Sarah. "Tomorrow we teach Cooper's men why raiders never troubled Antietam after they learned about the ghost." Dawn found Thomas behind his barn, 6 townsmen lined up with rifles, while Sarah watched from the fence. The morning air was crisp, perfect for teaching the fundamentals he'd learned so long ago. "Breathing controls everything," he explained, adjusting Miller's grip on his rifle. "Inhale, acquire your target, exhale halfway, then hold. The shot comes between heartbeats." "Between heartbeats?" Tommy Miller asked, standing beside his father. "How can anyone shoot that precise?" Thomas lifted his Spencer, demonstrating the fluid motion. "Watch!" His shot cracked across the yard, splitting a playing card pinned to the distant fence. "Feel your pulse in your trigger finger. Learn its rhythm. The heart steadies the hand, but its beat can move the barrel." "That's impossible," one of the men muttered. "Got to be luck." Thomas fired 5 more shots in rapid succession, each hitting the same spot. "Luck is what men call skill they don't understand. The Confederates thought I was lucky too, until they started counting their dead officers." A rider approached at speed. Jenny Martinez, daughter of the telegraph operator. "Mr. Hayes, Pa sent me. Messages coming in from 3 stations. Cooper's gathering more than just local guns. Professional killers, mercenaries, some even fought in the war." Thomas absorbed this while reloading. "Which side?" "Both," Pa says. "Men who learned killing during the war and never stopped." "Good," Thomas said quietly, surprising them. "Military men are predictable. They'll use tactics I know. Expect responses I can anticipate." He turned to his impromptu students. "That's your first lesson. Knowledge beats numbers. Understanding your enemy is more important than outgunning him." The training continued through morning. Thomas taught them to read wind from grass movement, To estimate ranges using familiar objects, to create clear fields of fire without revealing their positions. Each lesson was punctuated with stories from the war, practical experience paid for in blood. Cooper's men will be watching, he explained, showing them how to move without silhouetting themselves against the skyline. They'll expect farmers with guns, show them that, but be soldiers in disguise, just as I was a soldier disguised as a farmer. Sarah proved an apt pupil, absorbing every detail. Her youth gave her advantages: sharp eyes, steady hands, and a mind unburdened by fear of failure. Thomas recognized in her the same qualities that had made him a legend. "You've got the gift," he told her during a break. "The same stillness I had at your age, the ability to see patterns others miss." "Is that how you survived the war?" she asked. "Seeing patterns, patience, and preparation." He checked her rifle's sights. "Cooper's men are gathering strength, but they're also giving us time to prepare. They think it makes them stronger. Instead, it gives us the most valuable resource in any conflict: time to make ready." Sheriff Matthews arrived at noon with more news. "Cooper's offering gold for information about you. Claims you're not really the ghost, just a faker trading on the legend. Says he'll prove it by putting you in the ground." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Pride. Another pattern. He has to discredit me now, or his reputation suffers. That makes him predictable." "He's also hunting anyone who knows your real history," Matthews added. "Looking for weaknesses, old wounds, anything he can use." "Let him search," Thomas said, watching his students practice. "The real weakness isn't in what he'll find about my past. It's in his own future, his need to prove himself against a legend." The afternoon brought more grim news. Cooper's men had burned 3 outlying farms whose owners refused to help them. The message was clear: stand with the ghost, pay the price. "They're trying to isolate us," Thomas explained to his group. "Standard military tactic: cut off support, destroy resources, break morale. But they've made a critical mistake." "What's that?" Miller asked. "They think fear only works one way." Thomas smiled slightly. "They don't understand that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, but what you know is out there, watching, waiting. By sunrise tomorrow, Cooper's men will start finding evidence of that truth." "What are you planning?" Sarah asked, recognizing the steel in her uncle's voice. "Going to remind them why they called me Ghost," Thomas said softly. "Tonight, we show them that darkness has teeth, and patience is a weapon sharper than any blade." Midnight transformed the valley into a landscape of shadows and silver moonlight. Thomas moved like a ghost through the darkness, his steps silent despite 20 years of ranch work. 3 of Cooper's men had set up camp near Miller's north pasture. Believing themselves hidden, they didn't realize they were exactly where Thomas wanted them. "Watch and learn," he whispered to Sarah, who moved beside him with inherited stealth. He'd argued against bringing her, but her counter-arguments were sound. She knew the land, had young eyes, and most importantly, no one would expect her. The raiders had positioned themselves professionally. Elevated position, clear lines of sight, covered approach to their planned target. To most observers, their campsite would have seemed random. Thomas saw the tactical planning behind it. "They're using the rise to mask their fire," he explained softly. "Planning to hit the Miller. Place at dawn, when the sun would blind any defenders." He smiled slightly. "Good military thinking. Wrong war." Sarah watched him make subtle adjustments to his rifle. "How many?" 3 visible, 2 more hidden in the trees behind them. Standard picket arrangement. We used similar setups in Virginia. The raiders' confidence was their weakness. They'd seen farmers training with rifles and thought they understood the threat. They hadn't realized those farmers were being trained by a man who'd once held off an entire Confederate company single-handedly. "Thomas," positioned Sarah carefully. "Count to 100. Then strike that cooking pot with your stone, just like we practiced." He faded into darkness as Sarah began counting. The raiders continued their quiet conversation, discussing tomorrow's planned raid. They never noticed how the shadows around them had changed, how silence had become something active rather than passive. At 100, Sarah's thrown stone struck true. The cooking pot rang like a bell, startling the raiders to their feet. In that moment of confusion, Thomas's first shot cracked across the night. One raider's rifle flew from his hands, expertly shot away without drawing blood. "Ghost!" one man shouted, recognizing the precision of the shot. They dove for cover, but Thomas had spent the afternoon studying every rock and hollow. Each piece of cover they sought had been carefully prepared, positioned to channel them exactly where he wanted. "Can't hide from a shadow, boys." Thomas's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Another shot disabled a second rifle. "Might want to consider returning to Cooper with a message." The hidden lookouts tried to flank the voice, walking straight into Sarah's line of sight. Her thrown stones, a skill Thomas had taught her that afternoon, struck their lantern. Darkness swallowed them completely. "That's 3 guns I've shot away," Thomas called conversationally. "Could have been 3 dead men. Remember that when you tell Cooper what happened here?" A third shot sent their last rifle spinning away into the darkness. Now completely disarmed, the raiders bunched together, trying to face every direction at once. Fear had replaced professional confidence. "The message?" one asked, voice shaking. "Tell Cooper the ghost remembers how to hunt. Tell him every man. He sends we'll come back with stories of shots that could have killed but didn't. Tonight was mercy. Tomorrow might not be." The raiders ran, leaving their camp and disabled weapons behind. Only when their hoofbeats faded did Thomas emerge from the shadows, Sarah joining him at his signal. "They'll tell Cooper," she said, collecting the disabled rifles. "They'll tell everyone," Thomas corrected. "Fear spreads faster than bullets. By morning, every hired gun in Cooper's camp will be watching shadows, jumping at sounds, wondering if the ghost is already in their sights. You could have killed them. Death teaches one lesson, fear teaches many." He examined the abandoned camp. "In the war, I learned that terror of the unseen does more damage than the visible enemy. Cooper's men came west expecting simple violence. Instead, they'll face something worse, the knowledge that every shadow might hold death, waiting patiently for the perfect shot." Dawn revealed the raiders' story had indeed spread. Cooper's men, previously swaggering through town, now moved in groups, eyes darting nervously at every movement. They'd come expecting to fight farmers. Instead, they found themselves hunted by a legend they'd thought safely buried in history. But Thomas, watching from his ranch, knew this was just the beginning. Cooper would respond with greater force, trying to overwhelm Shadow with numbers. The real war was still coming. "Time to make ready," he told Sarah as they watched the sun rise. "Tonight, we showed them the ghost still haunts. Tomorrow we teach them why that should terrify them." Cooper's response came at noon the next day, announced by the smoke of 3 burning homesteads on the valley's outskirts. Thomas watched the black columns rise through his spyglass, noting how the fires had been set to be visible from every farm in the region, a message written in flame and fear. "Simmons' family got out in time," Sheriff Matthews reported, riding up to the ranch. "Henderson's too. But old man Carroll—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew the stubborn rancher would have tried to save his horses. Thomas lowered his glass, memories of other smoke columns, other wars, drifting through his mind. Cooper's learning. Using terror tactically now. "He's brought in new men," Matthews continued, "different from the usual hired guns. Military bearing, professional equipment. One of them," he hesitated, "one of them asked specifically about Antietam, about your service record." "Expected that." Thomas checked his rifle's action. "Cooper can't just kill me now. He has to destroy. The legend proved the ghost was never real. His reputation depends on it." Sarah approached from the barn, her face tight with worry. More riders coming in. Martha Wilson says they're offering gold to anyone who'll burn their neighbor's property, turning people against each other. Thomas nodded grimly. Divide and conquer. Basic strategy. Break the community spirit, isolate the target, then move in for the kill. His voice carried the weight of experience. Saw the Confederates try it in Maryland. Didn't work then either. A rider appeared on the North Ridge, one of Cooper's new professionals, making sure he was seen. The man raised a mirror, flashing, a signal that Thomas instantly recognized from his war days. "What's he saying?" Sarah asked, seeing her uncle's expression harden. "We know about Petersburg," Thomas translated. "They've found records from my last battle, the one that ended my war service." His hands tightened on his rifle. "Cooper's done his research." Matthews shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas, about Petersburg. The stories are true," Thomas finished quietly. 63 men, all killed with a single shot each over 3 days. The Confederate commander called it murder. Our generals called it necessary. I called it war. He turned to Sarah. "That's why I chose this life, this valley. Thought I could leave that part of me behind." More riders appeared on surrounding ridges, each positioned to watch the ranch. Cooper was tightening the noose, showing Thomas he was surrounded, studied, known. A young boy raced up on a pony, one of Tommy Miller's friends who'd been acting as messenger. "Mr. Hayes, Cooper's men are in town. They're—" He gulped air. "They're nailing something to every door." Thomas didn't need to ask what. The notice would be carefully worded, professional, an offer of peace in exchange for surrendering the false ghost, a promise of violence if refused, and buried in the words would be details about Petersburg, about the 3 days of precision killing that had made even hardened soldiers whisper about the ghost's true nature. "He's trying to turn them against you," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "Make them fear you more than him." "Smart play," Thomas admitted. "Community stood with me against simple bandits, but a calculated killer from the war? That's a different kind of fear." He began cleaning his rifle with practiced motions. Cooper's learning, making this personal, psychological, fighting a ghost with shadows of the past. Matthews straightened in his saddle. "What do we do?" "We remind them of something Cooper's forgotten." Thomas's voice carried iron certainty. "Yes, the ghost was feared, but he was feared because he protected something worth protecting. Every shot at Petersburg saved 10 other lives. Every kill prevented a larger slaughter." He turned to Sarah, seeing not just his niece, but the future he'd tried to build here. "Cooper wants to make this about the ghost's body count? Fine, let's show him why those numbers existed. Not for glory or power, but because sometimes the only way to stop evil is to be better at violence than violent men." A new signal flashed from the ridge. Thomas read it without translating, his face hardening. "Uncle?" Sarah asked. "What did that one say?" "That Cooper knows about you," Thomas replied softly. "Knows you're my student now." The message was simple. Ghosts shouldn't teach their secrets to children. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Cooper had just changed the rules, made the personal professional. He'd crossed a line that transformed Thomas from a defender back into something else, something that had once made an entire Confederate army tremble at the ghost's name. "Time to remind them," Thomas said, his voice carrying the chill of Antietam's dawn. "Why some legends are born in blood." Thomas spent the afternoon positioning his people like chess pieces on a deadly board. Miller and his son were sent to guard the South Valley approach, their strength hidden behind apparent weakness. The Martinez family's barn became a forward observation post, its high loft offering perfect angles on Cooper's camp. Every move was calculated, every position chosen with the precision that had once made the ghost legendary. "Cooper's men are watching," Sarah noted, helping him prepare ammunition. "Won't they see what we're doing?" "They'll see what I want them to see," Thomas replied, measuring powder with surgical care. Frightened townspeople trying to defend themselves, farmers playing at being soldiers. His eyes held the cold focus she remembered from his shooting lessons. They won't recognize military strategy disguised as desperation. Sheriff Matthews arrived with news from town. Cooper's brought in a specialist, fellow named Hawkins, ex-army scout, claims he hunted deserters during the war. Hawkins. Thomas's hands stilled on his rifle. Used to call him the Bloodhound, never lost a trail. He smiled slightly. Never had to hunt a ghost before, though. He's setting up systematic searches, Matthews continued. Grid patterns, professional tracking. Says he'll find your hiding spots, your escape routes. Let him look. Thomas checked sightlines through his scope. While he's hunting shadows, we'll be changing the landscape itself. Throughout the day, Thomas's preparations transformed the valley without seeming to change anything at all. Haystacks were positioned to block specific approaches. Wagon wheels were subtly weakened, ready to break if used for cover. Even the cattle were part of his strategy, placed to break up enemy formations with their movement. Your uncle, Miller said to Sarah as they worked. He's not just a shooter, is he? This is something else. Sarah watched Thomas coordinate the valley's defense, seeing how each piece fit a larger design. In the war, she said quietly, they called him Ghost because you never saw him coming. But the real reason he was feared, he didn't just kill, he controlled the battlefield itself. Cooper's response to the preparations was predictable to anyone who understood military thinking. His men began probing defenses, testing responses, looking for weaknesses. They found exactly what Thomas wanted them to find. They hit the Henderson place, Tommy reported, riding in at dusk. Just like you said they would, 4 men, thinking it was undefended. And? Thomas asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Miller's boys were waiting, just where you put them. 2 shots fired, no one hurt, but Cooper's men ran like scalded cats. Tommy grinned. They'll tell others the house was heavily defended. When really, Sarah added, understanding dawning, you'd positioned 2 men to sound like 20. Thomas nodded approvingly. Fear multiplies forces. Cooper's men will report strong resistance. He'll waste time and men trying to overcome defenses that don't exist, while our real strength remains hidden. As night fell, more reports arrived. Cooper's men had found empty sniper nests exactly where Thomas had planted them to be discovered. They'd spotted lookouts who didn't exist, decoded false signals, and mapped defensive positions that were purely theatrical. Hawkins won't be fooled for long, Matthews warned. Man's too good at his job. Don't need long, Thomas replied, making final adjustments to his rifle. Just need him looking the wrong way at the right moment. Sarah, watching him prepare, saw the change coming over her uncle. The quiet farmer was fading, replaced by something older and deadlier. His hands had stopped trembling entirely, and his eyes held the focused distance she imagined they'd had at Antietam. You're going hunting tonight, she said. It wasn't a question. Ghost needs to remind them why the name matters. He checked his ammunition one final time. Cooper wants to use my reputation? Fine. Let's show him what that reputation cost the last army that underestimated it. The valleys watched, Matthews said. Hawkins has men on every high ground. Thomas's smile was cold as winter steel. Good. Means they'll be silhouetted against the stars. Easier to count that way. He turned to Sarah. Remember what I taught you about counting between heartbeats? Tonight's your first real test. While they're hunting the ghost in the shadows, you'll be my eyes in the bell tower. You're letting her help? Matthews asked, surprised. Cooper made. Her a target, Thomas replied, his voice hardening. Might as well teach her to be a deadly one. He looked at his niece with fierce pride. Time to show them that old ghosts can raise new ones. The church bell tower offered a perfect vantage point over Eagle's Rest. Sarah watched through her uncle's spare spyglass as townspeople hurried through the darkening streets, some casting furtive glances toward Cooper's men, others meeting in whispered clusters. But it was the pattern of these meetings that caught her attention, just as Thomas had taught her. "Judge Morrison's house," she whispered to Thomas, who knelt beside her in the shadows. "That's the 4th town council member to visit in 2 hours. Same ones who voted against Sheriff Matthews last spring." Thomas nodded slightly. "Notice how they're timing their visits, never more than one at a time. Military coordination disguised as social calls." Below, Cooper's men maintained their visible presence, but Thomas had spotted something Sarah missed: how they never seemed to patrol near certain properties, including Morrison's. "Some fights," Thomas said quietly, "aren't won with rifles. Watch the bank." Right on cue, Harold Phillips, the bank manager, emerged with a heavy ledger. He walked quickly, nervously, but not toward the bank vault. Instead, he headed for the back of Morrison's house. "Financial records," Thomas explained. "Cooper's corrupted more than just hired guns. He's built a network inside Eagle's Rest itself. Morrison, Phillips, probably half the town council. Men who stand to profit if Cooper takes control." "But why?" Sarah asked. "They're respected men, leaders. Power attracts power. Cooper offers them something they want: bigger influence, wider connections, more control." Thomas's voice carried old knowledge. "Saw the same thing in Virginia. Not every enemy wore a grey uniform." Movement near the livery stable caught Sarah's attention. Hawkins, the tracker, was conferring with Ben Wallace, who ran the general store. Wallace was pointing toward the valley, making gestures Sarah recognized, describing patrol routes, guard positions. "Another traitor," she whispered. "Another piece on the board," Thomas corrected, "each one telling us more about Cooper's real plan." He studied the pattern of meetings through his scope. This isn't just about revenge anymore. He's preparing for something bigger. Sheriff Matthews slipped into the tower, moving silently despite his age. Thomas got word from the telegraph office. Cooper's been sending coded messages east, military ciphers. "Virginia?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Matthews nodded grimly. "Richmond. Seems our friend Cooper has connections to some former Confederate officers, wealthy ones, looking to build empires out west." The pieces clicked into place. Thomas had seen this pattern before, in the chaos after the war. Ambitious, men using old military networks to seize power in vulnerable territories. "Morrison's land deals," Sarah said suddenly. "The ones he's been pushing through council. They're not random." "No," Thomas agreed. "They form a corridor, perfect route for moving men and materials without drawing attention. Cooper's not just planning to take Eagle's Rest. He's building an army." A signal lamp flashed from Morrison's back window, 3 short, 2 long. Thomas translated automatically. "They're meeting tonight, all of them. Cooper, Morrison, the whole conspiracy." "Perfect time to strike," Matthews suggested. "Take them all at once." But Thomas was already shaking his head. "That's what they want. They've prepared for direct confrontation." His eyes took on the distant focus Sarah recognized from his shooting lessons. "Time to show them why ghosts are feared, not for what they do, but for what they know." He turned to Sarah. "Remember what I taught you about patience, about waiting for the perfect moment?" When she nodded, he continued. "Tonight, we let them think they're safe in their plotting. Let them believe their secrets are hidden, while we do what?" Matthews asked. "While we prepare to fight a different kind of war." Thomas checked his rifle with practiced hands. "Cooper expects the ghost of Antietam to attack from the shadows. Instead, we're going to expose every shadow they're hiding behind." Sarah understood. "We're not just fighting Cooper's men. We're fighting the corruption they've built." "Every empire falls," Thomas said softly, "when its foundations are exposed. Cooper wants to use my reputation? Fine, let's show him why the ghost was feared by colonels and generals, not just soldiers. Some shots kill men, others kill conspiracies. As darkness claimed Eagle's Rest, lights burned in Morrison's study, the conspirators gathered, thinking themselves protected by Cooper's men and their own respectability. They never noticed how the shadows around them had changed, how every whispered word carried to patient ears, how each secret they shared became another weapon in the ghost's arsenal. The war for Eagle's Rest was about to change, not with gunfire and violence, but with the deadlier ammunition of truth and exposed lies. Thomas Hayes had learned at Antietam that some battles are won with bullets, but others, the ones that truly matter, are won by knowing when not to pull the trigger. The meeting in Morrison's study lasted 3 hours. Thomas and Sarah watched from the bell tower as Eagle's Rest's most prominent citizens arrived and departed, each taking careful routes to avoid being seen together. But it was the last arrival that made Thomas's blood run cold. Sheriff Matthews slipped into Morrison's back door just before midnight. "No," Sarah whispered. "He fought with you. He knows what you are." "Exactly," Thomas replied, his voice tight. "He knows exactly what I am." 20 years of trust crystallized into something darker. And he's been reporting it all to Cooper. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Matthews had been there when Thomas arrived in Eagle's Rest, had helped him establish his cover story, had known every detail of his war record, his capabilities, his methods. "The Petersburg operation," Thomas said quietly. Cooper's men knew too much about it, details that were never in official records, because Matthews was there. Sarah's hands tightened on the spyglass. "All those years watching you, helping you maintain your secret, he was documenting everything. My habits, my skills, how I think." Thomas's mind raced through 2 decades of conversations, shared confidences, trusted secrets. Building a blueprint for someone who'd eventually need to kill the ghost. Movement below caught their attention. Cooper himself was approaching Morrison's house, flanked by Hawkins. The tracker's arrival confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a war council. Through the study's window, they could see Matthews spreading papers on Morrison's desk. Even from the bell tower, Thomas recognized his own rifle targets, diagrams of his firing positions, notes on his tactical preferences. 20 years, Sarah breathed. He spent 20 years preparing for this moment. "Not just preparing," Thomas corrected grimly. "Waiting. Cooper's not the mastermind here. He's the weapon Matthews has been waiting to use." As if confirming his words, Matthews began pointing out locations on a map of the valley. Even at this distance, Thomas could read his old friend's body language, the confident gestures of a man finally unveiling a long-planned strategy. "But why?" Sarah asked. "Why wait so long?" "Because he needed the right moment, the right resources." Thomas's voice carried the weight of bitter understanding. Cooper's Confederate connections, Morrison's land deals, the bank's cooperation. Matthews orchestrated all of it, building a power structure bigger than just Eagle's Rest. Through his scope, Thomas could see Matthews drawing lines on the map, showing Cooper's men optimal firing positions, the same positions Thomas himself had taught him about during the war. "We have to warn the others." Sarah started to rise, but Thomas caught her arm. "Who?" he asked softly. "The townspeople who trust Matthews as their sheriff? Miller and his men who follow Matthews' orders? We don't know how deep this goes. Who else has been compromised?" A signal lamp flashed from Morrison's window, a code Thomas and Matthews had used at Antietam. The message was meant for him, he realized. Matthews knew he'd be watching. "What's it say?" Sarah asked. "Your move, Ghost," Thomas translated. "Just like Petersburg." The reference hit him like a physical blow. Petersburg had been more than just his last battle. It had been the operation that revealed the true cost of being the Ghost, the mission that showed how precision killing could become something worse than warfare. "He's not just using my methods against me," Thomas said, understanding dawning. "He's recreating Petersburg itself, forcing me to become what I was then, what I swore I'd never be again. Sarah studied her uncle's face in the darkness. What happened at Petersburg? Really? I didn't just kill 63 men, Thomas replied, his voice distant. I destroyed an entire command structure, systematically, precisely, turned their own defensive positions into a killing ground, made them fear their own fortifications. He closed his eyes briefly, made them understand that nowhere was safe. No one could be trusted. Every shadow held death. Like Matthews is doing to us now, Sarah realized, using our own preparations against us. Thomas nodded slowly. He knows I'll figure out his betrayal, knows I'll start seeing enemies everywhere. That's what he wants, to turn me back into the killer I was, make me prove every dark story about the ghost was true. The implications spread through Eagle's Rest like poison. Every defensive position Thomas had created, every ally he'd positioned, every strategy he'd developed, Matthews knew them all, had helped design them, had spent 20 years learning exactly how to turn them into a trap. What do we do? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. Thomas stared down at the conspirators in Morrison's study, at 2 decades of friendship turned to ash, at the carefully constructed piece of his new life crumbling under the weight of old sins. We do what they don't expect, he said finally. They want the ghost of Antietam, fine, but this time we show them something they've forgotten about ghosts. His voice hardened with deadly purpose. Sometimes the most dangerous spirit isn't the one seeking revenge. It's the one with nothing left to lose. Thomas's first move, after discovering Matthews's betrayal, was not what anyone expected. He did nothing, no shots fired, no dramatic escape, no visible response at all. He simply watched as the conspirators left Morrison's house as Cooper's men, resumed their patrols as Eagle's Rest settled into uneasy darkness. They'll be waiting for us to run, he explained to Sarah as they left the bell tower. Expecting panic, desperate moves. Matthews knows how I think or how I used to think. So what are we doing instead? Becoming something new. Thomas led her through back alleys he'd mapped years ago, moving like a shadow. The ghost they're hunting died at Petersburg. Time to show them what 20 years of peace creates in a man who once dealt only in death. They reached the livery stable without being seen. Thomas had cached supplies here years ago, another preparation Matthews knew about. But what his old friend didn't know was why. Your father's letters, Thomas said, retrieving a hidden strongbox. The ones he wrote during the war, before the fever took him. Matthews thinks he knows all my secrets, but he never knew about these. Sarah took the weathered envelopes with trembling hands. Her father had been Thomas's spotter at Antietam, had died before she was born. What do they tell us? Not what. Who? Thomas pulled out a carefully preserved map. Your father wasn't just my spotter. He was my conscience. The one who helped me see that precision killing wasn't just about accuracy. It was about choosing not to kill when you could. The map showed a network of caves in the high country, known only to the local tribes. Sarah's father had discovered them while scouting for the army, had shared their location only with his brother. Matthews expects me to fight like the ghost. Thomas continued gathering specific supplies to turn this valley into a killing ground, just like Petersburg. Instead, we're going to show him something he's forgotten about war. What's that? That the deadliest soldier isn't the one who kills best. Thomas checked his rifle with practiced hands. It's the one who knows why not to kill at all. Dawn would find Eagle's Rest in chaos. Thomas's ranch empty, his defensive positions abandoned. Cooper's men would search the valley, following trails Matthews had spent 20 years documenting. They would find exactly nothing, because the ghost they sought, the killer they feared, had chosen to become something else. Not a vengeful spirit, dealing death from shadows, but a protector using 2 decades of peace to defend life instead of end it. Your father taught me that. Thomas told Sarah as they prepared to vanish into the high country. At Petersburg, I broke something in myself, became death incarnate, but here in this valley, I learned to be human again. He looked back at Eagle's Rest, at 20 years of peaceful life now turned to weapon against him. Matthews had wanted to recreate Petersburg, to force the ghost back into being that perfect killer. Instead, he would learn what Thomas had spent 20 years becoming, something far more dangerous than a simple ghost. A man who had mastered death not to deal it, but to prevent it. A protector who knew that true strength lay not in taking life, but in knowing exactly when to spare it. The war for Eagle's Rest was about to change, not with the brutal efficiency of the ghost, but with the careful wisdom of a man who had learned that some battles are won without firing a shot at all. The high country caves offered more than shelter. They provided a perfect vantage point over the entire valley. Thomas watched through his scope as Cooper's men began their morning search, following exactly the patterns Matthews had predicted. 20 years of observation turned against its master. "They're splitting up," Sarah reported, using her father's old spyglass. "4 groups, just like you said they would." Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. "Matthews taught them my old tactics, showed them how the ghost would think. But he forgot something important about spirits." "What's that?" "They learn, they evolve." Thomas shifted position, tracking Cooper's lead group through his scope. "Your father's letters taught me that. Every shot doesn't have to kill. Sometimes the threat of precision is deadlier than precision itself." His first demonstration came when Cooper's men reached the abandoned ranch. They found it empty, but as they began searching, a single shot rang out. The bullet struck the ground between 2 searchers, kicking up dust precisely 6 inches from their feet. The message was clear. They lived because the shooter chose to miss. "Watch what happens next," Thomas instructed Sarah. Matthews taught them military responses. "Count the mistakes." Sure enough, the searchers followed textbook procedure, taking cover, establishing fields of fire, preparing for an assault that never came. While they fortified their position, Thomas was already moving through the cave network to another firing point. His second shot came from an impossible angle, threading between rocks to knock a hat off the lead tracker's head. Again, the message was clear. Death had passed close enough to touch, then chosen to spare them. "They're getting nervous," Sarah observed, looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows. "Fear," Thomas said quietly, "is like water. Matthews thinks he can control it, channel it, but fear flows where it will, wearing away the strongest foundations." Throughout the morning, Thomas continued his deadly demonstration, never killing, never wounding, but showing with each precisely placed shot that death was a choice he was deliberately not making. Cooper's men began bunching together, abandoning their search patterns, looking for threats in every shadow. But Thomas's real target wasn't Cooper's men. It was the foundation of Matthews's carefully constructed conspiracy. A shot split the air. As Judge Morrison rode out to his outlying property, the bullet severed his saddlebag strap, spilling papers across the trail, papers documenting illegal land deals and payoffs. Cooper's men, rushing to protect him, arrived just in time to see local ranchers discovering the evidence. "Reputation," Thomas explained to Sarah as they relocated. "Matthews spent 20 years building his network on trust and fear. Now we show everyone what's behind the facade." Another shot shattered a window at the bank, sending glass raining down on Phillips as he tried to hide ledgers showing suspicious transfers. The timing was perfect, right as customers were waiting for the bank to open. "They're starting to see," Sarah realized, "not just Cooper's violence, but the corruption that invited it." Thomas nodded. "Matthews wanted to recreate Petersburg. Thought he could use my old tactics against me." He lined up another shot, this one splitting open a saddlebag full of bearer bonds being secretly transferred to Cooper's men. But he forgot the most important lesson from that battle, which was that the ghost's real power wasn't in killing, it was in controlling the battlefield itself. Thomas watched as panic began spreading through Cooper's men, as townspeople started whispering about the exposed corruption, as Matthews's careful plans began unraveling thread by thread. "Uncle," Sarah said suddenly, spotting movement through her glass. "Miller and his men, they're turning back Cooper's scouts, and there, the Martinez family just refused to let Morrison's men search their property. The valley's waking up," Thomas confirmed. "Seeing the real enemy isn't just Cooper's guns, but the rot that invited them in." His next series of shots demonstrated this lesson with surgical precision. Tax records showing bribes fell from a saddlebag. Outside the saloon, a letter linking Morrison to Confederate sympathizers fluttered down Main Street, each revelation carefully placed, each shot showing not just skill, but purpose. "They're running scared," Sarah reported as Cooper's men began pulling back to defensive positions. "But not from bullets. From truth," Thomas agreed. "Matthews thought he could use my reputation to create fear. Instead, we're using it to expose secrets." He smiled slightly. "Some ghosts don't just haunt, child, they reveal." By noon, the valley had transformed. Cooper's men found themselves increasingly isolated as townspeople began standing together, protecting each other, sharing what they'd learned about the conspiracy. The corruption Matthews had spent 20 years building was crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. "He'll have to respond," Sarah said, as they watched another group of Cooper's men retreat from angry townspeople. "Matthews won't let his plans fall apart like this." "No," Thomas agreed, reloading his rifle with the same precision he'd once used to terrorize Confederate lines. "He'll do exactly what he did at Petersburg when his first strategy failed. He'll escalate, try to drown truth in blood." He turned to Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same determination her father had shown all those years ago. "That's when we show him the last lesson your father taught me about ghosts." "What's that?" "That the deadliest spirit isn't the one that brings death." Thomas chambered around with practiced care. "It's the one that makes evil destroy itself." Matthew's response came at sunset, announced by the screams of women and children. Cooper's men drove townspeople into the square at gunpoint while buildings burned around them. The sheriff had abandoned any pretense of law, showing the iron beneath 20 years of false friendship. "Thomas Hayes!" Matthew's voice boomed across the valley. "You've spent all day showing off your aim. Now let's see how precise you can be when the targets are innocent lives." From their cave vantage point, Thomas and Sarah watched the town's transformation into an armed camp. Cooper's men had positioned hostages carefully, using them as human shields. Every firing position Thomas had established was now covered by multiple guns. "He's using your own plans," Sarah whispered. "The defensive positions you created are now a trap," Thomas finished grimly. But Matthews forgot something about traps. The best ones work both ways. Through his scope, Thomas counted positions, angles, vulnerabilities. Matthews had indeed turned his preparations against him, but in doing so he'd made his men predictable. They were soldiers following a dead man's tactics, while Thomas had spent 20 years learning new ones. "Your father's last letter," Thomas said quietly, checking his ammunition. "The one he wrote just before the fever took him. Know what it said?" Sarah shook her head. "That the true measure of a shooter isn't in how many he kills, but in how many he chooses not to." Thomas's hands moved over his rifle with practiced care. "Matthews thinks he knows how the ghost fights. Expects me to start killing his men one by one, like at Petersburg. But that's not the plan." "No." Thomas smiled slightly. "The plan is to show him what 20 years of peace teaches a man about violence." He began laying out specific rounds, each one measured and marked with careful precision. "Cooper's men are professionals. They'll hold position as long as they think they're in control. But the moment that control slips, they'll panic. Sarah finished, understanding dawning, and their panic will spread to the townspeople. Creating chaos, the one thing Matthews can't control. Thomas checked sightlines one final time. He's built his power on fear and precision. Time to show him what real precision looks like. A signal fire blazed from the church tower, Matthews using their old war codes one final time. The message was clear: surrender by dawn, or the hostages start dying. He's getting desperate, Sarah observed, showing his true nature. Good. Thomas's voice carried iron certainty. Desperate men make mistakes, and Matthews just made his biggest. And yet, what's that? He showed the town exactly what he is. Thomas began moving through the cave network, Sarah following with inherited stealth. All those years of carefully maintained authority, of hidden corruption and secret deals, gone. Now they see the truth. They emerged on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. The position offered perfect angles on the town square, though Matthews would have calculated that, expected it. Look closer, Thomas instructed his niece. Not at Cooper's men, at the townspeople. Sarah studied the scene through her glass. Slowly, she began to see what her uncle had noticed. Subtle movements among the hostages, Miller's son passing something hidden from hand to hand, the Martinez brothers slowly shifting position, creating gaps in the human shield. They're not just victims, she realized. They're preparing. 20 years teaching this valley more than just shooting, Thomas confirmed, teaching them about patience, about timing, about waiting for the perfect moment. He began arranging his marked rounds in precise order. Matthews thinks he controls the battlefield because he holds the town, but the town isn't what he thinks it is. The sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the valley in deepening shadows. In town, Cooper's men lit torches, trying to push back the darkness. But darkness had been the ghost's ally long before these men learned to fear it. Time to remind Matthews, Thomas said softly, chambering the first round, why some legends survive. Not because of how many they kill, but because of how they choose to end the killing. He turned to Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same steady courage her father had shown at Antietam. Watch carefully, child. You're about to see why they really called me Ghost, not for the men I shot, but for how I could make an entire army defeat itself without firing a single killing shot. The night deepened as Thomas made his final preparations. Tomorrow would bring either victory or destruction. But as he watched Matthews trying to control a situation already spiraling beyond his grasp, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The ghost of Antietam was about to give his old friend one last lesson in the true nature of precision. Dawn painted Eagle's Rest in shades of blood and gold as Thomas chambered his first round. Through his scope, he watched Matthews pacing the town square, checking positions, moving hostages, still thinking like the soldier he'd been 20 years ago. Count them, Thomas instructed Sarah softly, just like I taught you. 32 armed men, she reported using her father's spyglass. 8 in the bell tower, 12 around the square, the rest spread through buildings. All positioned exactly where you used to put your defenders, and the townspeople, scared, but she paused, noting subtle details. Miller's sons have worked their way to the edge of the group. Martinez family's doing the same on the other side. They're creating lanes, just like you showed them. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Matthews thinks he's recreating Petersburg, thinks he knows how this ends. He settled into position, feeling the old familiar calm settle over him. Time to show him how 20 years changes a ghost. His first shot came as Matthews finished his ultimatum. The bullet split the air with surgical precision, striking the sheriff's badge dead center, spinning it off his chest without drawing blood. The message was clear. You live because I choose not to kill. Cooper's men reacted instantly, weapons trained on the surrounding hills. But Thomas was already moving, using the cave network to emerge at a different firing point. His second shot disarmed one of the bell tower guards, sending his rifle clattering to the street below. "Hold position!" Matthews shouted, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. This wasn't how the Ghost had fought at Petersburg. These weren't killing shots. Thomas's next series of shots came in rapid succession, each one precisely placed. A gun barrel bent, a hat removed, a rope securing hostages severed, every shot a demonstration not of death, but of absolute control. "He's playing with us," Cooper snarled, but his men were already showing cracks in their professional facade. They'd come expecting to fight a killer. Instead, they faced something worse, a master demonstrating their complete vulnerability. "Watch the hostages," Sarah whispered urgently. "They're ready." Thomas had seen it too, the subtle shifting, the prepared positions, the quiet coordination of people who'd spent 20 years learning from a master of patience. His next shot shattered the church bell, sending a cascade of sound across the square. It was the signal they'd been waiting for. The townspeople moved as one. Miller's sons dropped low, creating gaps in the human shield. The Martinez brothers surged forward, targeting pre-selected guards. 20 years of quiet training transformed farmers and shopkeepers into a coordinated force. "Now they understand," Thomas said softly, picking shots to support the town's resistance. "True strength isn't in killing, it's in knowing exactly when and how to act." Cooper's men found themselves caught in their own defensive positions, their carefully planned cover becoming a trap. Every move to regroup was met by precisely placed shots that herded them exactly where Thomas wanted them. "Thomas!" Matthews' voice carried rage and desperation. "You're supposed to be a killer, the Ghost of Antietam. Show yourself!" Thomas's response was another shot, this one splitting Matthews's gun belt, disarming him without drawing blood. "The ghost you knew died at Petersburg," he called back, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "What you're facing now is what 20 years of peace creates." The battle shifted as Cooper's men began to break. Professional discipline crumbled under the weight of precision and coordination. They'd been trained to fight soldiers, to kill enemies. Instead, they faced a town united under the guidance of a man who'd spent 20 years teaching them something more powerful than violence. "Your father would be proud," Thomas told Sarah as they relocated again. "He always said the true test of a warrior isn't in how many he kills, but in how many he inspires to stand against killing." The sun climbed higher as Thomas's strategy unfolded. Each shot was placed not to kill, but to demonstrate complete control of the battlefield. Cooper's men found themselves pushed into increasingly smaller spaces, their options disappearing one precise shot at a time. "It's over, Matthews," Thomas called out as the last of Cooper's men surrendered. "You wanted to recreate Petersburg? Show everyone the killer I was." Another shot rang out, cutting Matthews' sleeve without breaking skin. "Instead, you've shown them what I became, what this valley taught me about the true meaning of precision." Matthews stood alone in the square now, his carefully constructed conspiracy lying in ruins around him. "You're still a killer, Thomas," he spat, "just hiding behind peace like you hid behind that rifle all those years ago." Thomas's final shot knocked the gun from Matthews's hand as he tried to draw. "Wrong again, old friend. I'm not hiding at all. I'm showing you exactly what I am." He emerged from cover, rifle held ready, but not aimed. A man who learned that the deadliest weapon isn't the ability to take life. "What then?" Matthews demanded. "The wisdom to know when not to." Thomas kept his voice steady as townspeople moved to secure the surrendering gunman. "You spent 20 years studying how I kill. Should have spent that time learning why I chose to stop." Sunset found Thomas Hayes back at his ranch, his rifle cleaned and returned to its place above the fireplace. The valley had changed in ways that went deeper than the physical damage of battle. Cooper's men were in custody, Matthews and his conspirators faced federal charges, and the townspeople had begun the work of rebuilding not just their buildings, but their trust in each other. Sarah found him on the porch, watching the last light paint the hills in familiar gold. "Miller says they found more of Matthews' records," she reported. 20 years of notes about you, about the valley. He really did spend all that time planning this." "Planning for the ghost he remembered," Thomas corrected softly. "Never understood that the valley changed more than just my aim." Inside, voices carried from the kitchen where townspeople had gathered, not in fear now, but in solidarity. The Martinez family bringing food, Miller discussing repairs, children playing without looking over their shoulders. "They're calling you." "Hero?" Sarah said, settling beside him. "No." Thomas shook his head. "They're the heroes. Every person who stood up, who chose to fight not with hatred, but with precision and purpose. The valley taught me that lesson. Today, they showed they learned it too." The evening brought more visitors, families sharing food and stories, children asking to see the rifle that had defended them, old-timers finally understanding why the quiet farmer's hands never shook when it mattered. But it was Tommy Miller's question that made Thomas pause. "Will you teach us more?" the boy asked. "Not just shooting, but everything else? About patience and precision and protecting what matters?" Thomas studied the boy, seeing in him the same hunger for knowledge he'd once seen in his own reflection. "Yes," he said finally, "but not just about warfare, about when not to fight, about the strength it takes to choose peace over power." As night settled over Eagle's Rest, Thomas stood on his porch one last time. The valley stretched before him, peaceful again but different, stronger, like a rifle barrel tempered by fire. The community had emerged harder but more purposeful. "Your father wrote something in his last letter," he told Sarah as they watched. "The stars emerge. Said that true legacy isn't in the lives we take, but in the lives we change. Took me 20 years to understand that fully. The ghost of Antietam would always be part of him. But now the legend meant something new. Not a tale of death and precision, but a story of protection and purpose, of a community that learned the greatest victory sometimes comes not from the shots you take, but from the ones you choose not to." As crickets began their evening song, Thomas Hayes, farmer, teacher, protector, finally found the peace he'd spent a lifetime learning to defend.